Hello, everybody. Welcome to the second discussion session for Econ 2, where we're going to be reviewing the law of comparative advantage. Hopefully, you've watched the lecture videos for Chapter 2, and if you have, you probably have a pretty good idea of what we're going to be talking about. But generally speaking, through these discussion sessions, I'm going to be focusing on material that students have traditionally had trouble with, either because it involves maybe a little bit more math, or it's just something that might be a little bit more complicated than the other parts of the chapter. So for our Week 2 discussion session, we are going to be focusing on doing these law of comparative advantage questions. With that in mind, these questions can be given to you in a variety of ways. So the example that we did in class for our lecture videos, I told you exactly how much each state or country could produce. This table tells you not how much each party here can produce, but how quickly they can produce it. So here it says the labor hours needed to make 1 pound of meat for the farmer is 8 hours, and for potatoes it's 2 hours. So if you look at this table and you think this is how much they can produce, you'd assume that the farmer is better at making meat than the rancher, which might not make a lot of sense, and the rancher is better at making potatoes than the farmer, which again might not make a lot of sense. But if you look at the heading of this chart, it says labor hours needed to make 1 pound of. So it takes the farmer 8 hours to make 1 pound of meat. It only takes the rancher 4 hours to make 1 pound of meat. So the rancher can make meat about twice as fast as the farmer. It takes the farmer 2 hours to make a pound of potatoes, whereas it takes the rancher 5 hours to make a pound of potatoes. So again, the farmer can make potatoes faster than the rancher. And again, that should probably make sense given their respective titles. So if looking at the table and it says the labor hours needed to make 1 pound of, if that starts to confuse you, then one way that you can get around this is convert it to the amount produced in a given amount of time, right? So again, if this confuses you, you can convert this information into how much one can produce by assigning a set amount of time to production. And I would just choose an amount of time that all four of those numbers can divide evenly into, right? So for example, you can divide 40 by 8, 2, 4, and 5 and get whole numbers. And again, this just converts everything into the amount produced rather than the amount of time it takes to produce something, right? So in other words, if we say that a farmer can make a pound of meat in 8 hours in a 40-hour work week, that means they can make 5 pounds of meat. If we say that it takes them 2 hours to make a pound of potatoes, then a 40-hour work week, they can make 20 pounds of potatoes. And if we say that that farmer can make, or sorry, that rancher can take 4 labor hours to make a pound of meat, that means in a 40-hour work week, they can make 10 pounds of meat. If it takes them 5 labor hours to make a pound of potatoes, then a 40-hour work week, they can make 8 pounds of potatoes, right? So from there, we can figure out the opportunity cost. Now, we can do it either way. So if you're okay looking at this table, then you can calculate the opportunity cost this way. After all, if it takes them 8 labor hours to make a pound of meat and 2 labor hours to make a pound of potatoes, then for every pound of meat they make, then that is 4 pounds of potatoes that they are not making. So 4 pounds of potatoes, so let's say 4 potatoes here, as the opportunity cost of making meat for the farmer. And then over here, again, if you're calculating opportunity cost, right, if they are focusing on making potatoes, then for every pound of potatoes they make, that is 1/4 of a unit of meat that they can no longer make. And again, if you were to look at these numbers over here, it would come out to be the same thing. So it's the same no matter how you do it. It's just for some people, it's easier to look at it in terms of the total amount of production than in the labor hours it needs to make a certain amount, right? So again, if this farmer can make 5 meat or 20 potatoes, then every time they're making meat, then that is 4 pounds of potatoes that they are not producing. And every time they're making potatoes, then that is 1/4 of a pound of meat that they are not producing, right? So now if we want to go ahead and look at the rancher, every time they are making meat, then they are not making potatoes. So if they spend 4 labor hours making a pound of meat, then that is 4/5 of a pound of potatoes that they are not making. So 4/5 of potato is what, or 4/5 a pound of potatoes is what's being given up. And if they spend this time making potatoes, right? So they spend 5 hours making potatoes, and they could have made 5/4 of a pound of meat in that time, or 1 1/4 of a pound of meat, if you prefer to think of it that way. right? That's the opportunity cost of focusing on potatoes. And again, it'd be the same units over here, right? So in other words, the opportunity cost of making meat, given that they can make 10 pounds of meat in a work week, is potatoes. And again, every pound of meat they make is 4/5 of potatoes that they can no longer make. And then every pound of potatoes they make is 5/4 or 1 1/4 pound of meat that they can no longer make, right? So again, when looking at these farmers when you're looking at the farmer and the rancher, in order to figure out who has the comparative advantage, you got to think of who can do things cheaper, right? So when it comes to making meat, right, the farmer gives up 4 pounds of potatoes for every pound of meat, whereas the rancher gives up 4/5 of a pound of potatoes for every unit of meat. So obviously the rancher is giving up fewer potatoes than the farmer. So the rancher has a comparative advantage in meat. And that means that the farmer must have the comparative advantage in potatoes, and we can see that, right? They only give up 1/4 of a pound of meat, whereas the rancher gives up 1 1/4 pounds of meat. So again, the farmer has the comparative advantage in potatoes, right? So again, you can see the same thing over here, right? The rancher gives up less potatoes whenever they make meat, whereas the farmer gives up less meat every time they make potatoes, right? So you can see who has the comparative advantage and what. Right. So again, if you can convert the labor hours needed to make 1 pound of into the pounds produced in a certain amount of time, it might be easier for you to work with those numbers. Although some people can look at this first chart and work with that fairly easily as well. Right. So again, it could be given to you either way: labor hours needed to make 1 pound of, or pounds produced in a certain amount of time. Either way, you should be able to get that answer. Again, just figure out who can produce it the cheapest. That's who has the comparative advantage. These are the types of questions I might ask you based off of these kinds of charts. So the first question might be referring to this table. What is the opportunity cost of 1 pound of meat for the farmer? So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to exit the full screen so we can just easily kind of go back. Right, so it's asking the opportunity cost of 1 pound of meat for the farmer. We already calculated that, right? For the farmer, if they're producing meat, then they're giving up 4 pounds of potatoes. Right, so 4 pounds of potatoes is kind of what you're looking for that answer there. Right, for the next question, it says, what is the opportunity cost of 1 pound of meat for the rancher? So again, if you're looking at this table, whenever the rancher is producing meat, they're giving up 4/5 of a pound of potatoes. So 4/5 is the answer you are looking for there, right? When it comes to the next question, it says the opportunity cost of 1 pound of potatoes for the farmer is, right? So again, we're going back to this table. And now we're looking at the farmer. What is the opportunity cost of producing potatoes? Well, it's 1/4 a pound of meat, right? So again, going back to this question, 1/4 a pound of meat is the answer you're looking for. And then the next question is, what is the opportunity cost of 1 pound of potatoes for the rancher? Again, looking at the rancher, whenever they're producing potatoes, they're giving up 5/4 or 1 1/4 pound of meat, right? So 5/4 pounds of meat, or C is the answer you're looking for on that one, right? So again, if you can go ahead and calculate the opportunity cost in advance for each person, for each good they're producing, right? You can pretty much answer any of those questions. Right? Now the next question asks, the rancher has a comparative advantage in, and again, if you go back to the table, we already solved that, right? The rancher has a comparative advantage in meat in that they give up fewer pounds of potatoes for every unit of meat that they produce, right? So the rancher has this question here, the rancher has a comparative advantage when it comes to producing meat, and the farmer has a comparative advantage when it comes to producing potatoes. So D is the answer you're looking for there. Remember that you can't have a comparative advantage in both goods, and you can't have a comparative advantage in neither good. So you can have the absolute advantage in both goods, but you can only have the comparative advantage in one. And then the next question here says, the farmer and the rancher could benefit if the farmer were to specialize in, and the correct answer here is potatoes, while the rancher specializes in meat. Remember, you want to specialize in that which you can produce at the lowest opportunity cost, or that for which you have that comparative advantage. So the rancher has a comparative advantage in meat, so they should specialize in meat, while the farmer specializes in potatoes. And then they get together and exchange, and both sides be made better off, right? Now, another way that you might see this question, just to make sure we cover all angles, and the way that you're going to see it on your discussion session activity, is a way that kind of combines the idea of the production possibilities curve with this law of comparative advantage. So it could be the case that the information you are given for a law of comparative advantage question will be given to you in the form of a table that shows the production possibilities for two economies. Right? So this first economy, Libos, if they devote all their resources to clothing, they can produce 6 units of clothing but no food. If they start taking units away from clothing to produce food, it happens at a rate of producing 2 more units of food, means a 2-unit reduction in clothing. Right? So in other words, when Libos goes to produce food, if they're adding 2 units of food, then they're giving up 2 units of clothing. And as you can see, that's kind of the same all the way down. So as they add 2 units of food, they're giving up 2 units of clothing, no matter where they are on the production possibilities curve process. That's what we call that constant opportunity cost, PPC, right? So given that they're exchanging 2 units of food for a unit of clothing, right, basically, or 2 units of food for 2 units of clothing, it comes up to the fact that the opportunity cost of food is 1 unit of clothing, and the opportunity cost of clothing is 1 unit of food, right? Because if you're giving up 2 to gain 2, it's the same as giving up 1 to gain 1 there, right? Now, when it comes to Slavia, when they go from 0 units of food to 1 unit of food, their clothing goes from 9 to 6. So as they add 1 unit of food, they're giving up 3 units of clothing. As you can see, that's kind of the same all the way down. Every unit of food that they add, they're giving up 3 units of clothing, all the way down to if they produce 3 units of food, they're not going to have any resources left for clothing, right? So the opportunity cost of 1 unit of food is 3 units of clothing, and the opportunity cost of 1 unit of clothing is 1/3 a unit of food, right? So again, that's how you do it if you were given a chart or a table that shows the production possibilities for two economies when figuring out who has the comparative advantage and what, right? And so use this information to be able to solve the questions on your all's discussion session assignment. So you'll have to go through a few questions using this table as well as a different one just to make sure you can calculate the opportunity cost on your own. But that's how you do it. You will be able to complete this assignment through iLearn. In this case, there are going to be multiple choice questions where there are right answers, and you only get the point for the question if you do choose the right answer. So make sure you watch this video carefully and that you know how to do these types of questions before attempting that discussion session assignment. And again, you can always contact your TAs during your discussion session class through Zoom. They'll be holding office hours at that time to answer any questions that you might have. Right? But if you feel like you got it, you got a good handle on this, then go ahead and try to complete that discussion session assignment, and you should be good to go for Module 2. As always, just let me know if you have any questions. You can either, again, contact your TAs during your regular discussion session class, or you can shoot me an email. I'll be happy to answer your questions for you. Or, again, come see me during my Zoom office hours. I'll be happy to answer those questions and help you out if you need it. But again, this is kind of the hardest part of Chapter 2 for a lot of students. So if you can do this, you should be good to go for this chapter. And yeah, I think that's it. So just let me know if you need anything.